QSO Today, episode 221, Arnold Ziegel W2HDI. This episode of QSO Today is sponsored by ICOM America, makers of the finest HF, VHF, and UHF transceivers for every level of the amateur radio operator, and by QRP Labs, makers of the QCX single-band transceiver kit, and now a new 10-watt all-band HF linear amplifier for the ham radio builder. Please support the QSO Today podcast by supporting these fine sponsors. Welcome to the QSO Today podcast. I'm Eric Guth, 4Z1UG, your host. After running Maritime Mobile from his 40-foot sailboat for many years, Arnold Ziegel W2HDI switched to power boats and all of the challenges to amateur radio brought by the new boat. Not deterred by these challenges, W2HDI discovered remote operation from his Maritime Mobile. We dive deeper into Arnold's ham radio story and remote operation in this QSO Today. W2HDI, this is Eric, 4Z1UG. Are you there, Arnie?
I am, Eric. Nice to talk to you.
Arnie, thanks for joining me on the QSO Today podcast. Can we start at the beginning of your ham radio story? When and how did it start for you?
Eric, I was a teenager. My father used to take me to the Cleveland Heights Public Library in Cleveland Heights, Ohio, where I grew up. And browsing the novels at one point, I came across a book called SOS at Midnight. This was about 1957, 1958, and it introduced me to the excitement of ham radio. That was my start, all by myself. I was approximately 13 years old.
So you read this book, SOS at Midnight. By the way, there have been other guests that have mentioned SOS at Midnight, and I'll put a link in the show notes page. But what happened after that? I mean, you read the book. You had to go start searching for potential mentors.
Well, I was trying to recall that, and I can't remember the details. I was in junior high school, and I must have had a friend. I can picture him. I can't remember his name, who either was a ham or I think he was a ham. He was probably a year or two older than me. He introduced me to his station, introduced me to what might be called an Elmer, Bill W2HDI, who operated a DX100 Heathkit in his dining room. And somehow I managed to get my novice license through him. I believe, however, I started by taking the Christmas tips from my paper route. I delivered the afternoon newspaper, the Cleveland Press in Cleveland, Ohio. And this was 1958, maybe January of 1959. And I bought a $60 Hallicrafter S38E. I had 60 customers in my paper route, and those were good days when I might get $1 Christmas tip, and took that money and bought the S38E receiver. I started listening. Then I was going to say I saved up my money. When I was getting ready to take the novice exam, learned the code, learned basic theory. Heathkit gave me credit. I am forever indebted to the old Heathkit company because as a 14-year-old kid, no guarantee from parents, Heathkit enabled me to buy the $60 kit, the DX40, on credit. I think I paid it off somewhere in the range of $5 a month. Built the DX40, achieved my novice license, went on the air with a 40-meter dipole and my S38E receiver. That was in August of 1959. Got excited about it, went ahead and got my general just a few months later. Had to take the test in person. So that would have been in September, October of 1959. And then upgraded the S38E, which I think it was a regenerative receiver, to an SX99. And I think I must have bought that used from the Lafayette radio store in downtown Cleveland. And then got active on local AM radio and a little bit of DX on 40 meters.
Now, my sense is that there were a lot of hams in Cleveland. Were you a member of any amateur radio clubs there?
There was one in South Euclid. I just don't remember the name of it. I didn't attend too many meetings, but I made a couple of good local friends. We sort of just got together and played radio.
And you played radio on 40 meters?
Oh, well, it was 40 meters, and then we all got active on 10-meter AM. Cleveland had something called the Road Patrol. I don't remember the rigs that people used, but it was 29, 160. We, of course, we were crystal controlled. Then I eventually got a Heathkit VF1 VFO that drifted like crazy. But we got very active on 10 meters, and 4 o'clock, 5 o'clock in the afternoon would get on. Guys had mobile radios. Again, this is 1959, 1960, 1961. But they used old police radio whips, and we had a lot of fun operating 10 meters, and of course worked at DX on 10 meters at the time as well.
And this was pre 2-meter repeater days.
Oh, very much so. The Heathkit lunch boxes, I think, were around, but those were also AM radios.
They were, yeah, on 2 and 6 meters, as a matter of fact.
That's right.
Yeah, how about that? Do you remember your first contact?
Yes, I do. As a teenager, in the Me Too movement, this probably isn't politically correct, but I remember working W6BRA in California on CW, and I was just thrilled that I worked a station with a call sign BRA.
Uh-huh. And do you remember who that was, or do you just remember the call sign?
No, I have no idea. No, I just remember W6BRA. That was the call.
Just to skip ahead a little bit, what's your current rig?
I have a set of rigs. The rig that I've been using for the last 10 years is an ICOM 756 Pro 3, which is just a magnificent radio. And that was the radio I used to get my 5-band DXCC. For mobile, I've gone through the entire range of ICOM radios, starting with the ICOM 706. That's what got me introduced to ICOM. And getting to know the menu on the 706, I operated the 706, then the 706 Mark II-G, then the ICOM 7000, then the ICOM 7100. I now have 2 ICOM 7100s, one of which I use for remote operation. Just picked up a second one for portable operation as well. And I had an Elecraft KX3 that I experimented with for a couple of years, sold it and replaced that with the new ICOM 7300. So in my base station, I have the 756 Pro 3, which I still prefer to the 7300. But I have the 7300 as well, which I use very easily for digital use.
Oh, that sounds really cool. Do you use a power amplifier or anything like that?
Well, I certainly do. I had an Ameritron AL80B for many years. I bought it used, had it for 15 years, the same tube, and it was just a wonderful amp. I got involved in remote operation about 2 years ago using remote rig. So I started looking around for an amplifier that would work well with remote rig, and I came across the Expert amps, and that has just turned out to be a phenomenal amp, especially if we're operating remotely.
Okay, well, so we're going to talk a little bit about operating remotely a little bit later, because I think there's kind of an evolution to this story, isn't there?
Oh, there certainly is.
Yeah, so let's kind of keep it in, as an evolutionary story, and then people will appreciate how it is that you are now operating remotely. Did ham radio play a part in the choices that you made for your education and career?
Well, unlike many of the people you speak to, the answer is not really. I enjoyed electronics. My older brother was an engineer, a chemical engineer. Nobody in my family had any electronic background, so I did this pretty much on my own. I don't think I've ever taken a formal course in electronics. Matter of fact, I know I have not, other than maybe high school physics, and I probably knew more than the instructor about radio at that time. I learned everything from the amateur radio handbook, so fundamentally self-taught. But I thought I would go into engineering, so I graduated from high school in Cleveland Heights, Ohio, attended Ohio State, started in engineering. Thought I would go into industrial engineering. Didn't care for it after my first year, and the advantage of going to a large university was that I was able to switch, moved over to the business school, fell in love with economics, and proceeded to pursue a career in economics and finance. So amateur radio and electronics has always been a hobby for me, purely.
You studied business and economics. Where did that take you?
Graduated at Ohio State with a degree in economics, applied directly to business school for an MBA, and ended up attending Columbia University, where I received my MBA in 1969 in finance. While I was at Columbia, I was a summer intern at Citibank in New York. Upon getting my MBA, I chose not to join Citibank immediately, went into the consulting industry, joined a firm in Boston, which is now defunct, but a large international consulting firm by the name of Arthur D. Little, which did a lot actually in telecommunications, and stayed there for a year and a half, and then decided to go back into banking. So I went back to Citibank and started my career back in New York with Citibank in 1970.
And you were there at Citibank for many years?
I was with Citibank until I retired in the year 2002, with a brief respite in 1981 when I left Citibank, went back to Arthur D. Little to do consulting for the banking industry, stayed about 6 months and went back to Citibank. So I like to joke that over the course of my 35-year business career of working full-time, I had 5 jobs and 2 employers. That's the American success story. Well, I was a kid from Cleveland who grew up in a lower middle class family. My father had a small business, then worked for the post office, and I was able to work my way through Ohio State with summer jobs because in those days education was for a state school was affordable, unlike today, and I was able to get a fellowship to Columbia by working very, very hard, and yes, I was very fortunate.
You write on your QRZ page that it took you 58 years to get 5-band DXCC. Why did it take so long?
It was just not something I focused on, and I've made tremendous friends through ham radio. And at the same time, worked very hard. When I was working in New York, raising a family, we have 2 daughters. I commuted into New York. We lived about 30 miles north of New York City. So I would leave the house at 6 o'clock in the morning, and when I wasn't traveling, I'd be home at 7:30, 8 o'clock at night. But I always had ham radio, but never a lot of time to pursue DX with big antennas. When we retired in 2002 and moved up to Vermont, we bought a house at 2,000 feet elevation, installed a tower at a Yagi, got the amplifier, so started getting a little bit more serious about it, but I still like to rag chew. About 5 years ago, on 40 meters one afternoon, I met Brian Rubel, W3BW, who was operating remotely out of Key West, Florida, and Brian sort of egged me on towards the DXCC. I think Brian now is approaching 3,000 DX challenge contacts. So he's almost at a record, and Brian's been a tremendous help and an incentive for me to pursue it. So once I started, and especially with Logbook of the World, it was an awful lot of fun, and especially trying to get 80 meters.
Now, when you finally decide to put your head down and go after the 5-band DXCC, did Brian give you a strategy for how to get it and how to get it perhaps more quickly?
Well, yes and no. He used a lot of logging programs. He would give me some hints when expeditions were on or certain stations were on. So he caused me to be much more focused on following the DXpeditions. But it was really just a matter of using HR Deluxe, seeing what stations were on, following countries that I had worked or had not worked. And I found the logging program in HR Deluxe showing me which countries I needed was very useful. So I would just look at it all the time and pounce.
You were actually pouncing on countries that you wanted. Did you spend a lot of time sending CQ to see who'd come back?
No, I almost never called CQ. It was always to listen, and it does take a certain technique of recognizing that you avoid not to get into the pileup, that you announce yourself at a certain time, and also I have to admit it's nice to have a big signal
from a 2,000-foot mountain.
Yes.
Yeah, why not on the East Coast?
On the East Coast,
right,
yes,
and
consequently, Asia is still a challenge for me. I have yet to work Mongolia. I think I'm one zone away from worked all zones, and I don't know. It's somewhere around Tibet, and I don't know if I'll ever achieve that.
Although it's my understanding that there are hams in Tibet, or in the mountain range there.
Yeah, no, there are hams there. I have a challenge with a bigger mountain to my north.
To go the polar route.
Yes, to go the polar route, which is the shorter route. I probably have to go the long path.
I haven't spent any time talking to anybody about DXCC, but since you're a recent expert on DXCC, do you have to vary your operating times even into the middle of the night in order to be able to get all of these countries?
Well, yes and no. It's really quite fascinating. There's a group on 40 meters early in the morning on 7163, led by Jim, WB2REM, whom you've interviewed on QSO Today. Jim does a phenomenal job of keeping this group together. And at 6 o'clock in the morning Eastern Time, Australia is coming through. So the sunset sunrise is often a very, very good time. So you don't have to stay up all night to do this on 80 or 40.
But you have to be somewhat strategic in terms of the other bands that you want. If you need to know when the 20-meter openings are going to happen for you to get to another spot in the world that you want.
Well, you do. Less so on 40 and 80. You have to choose the time correctly. But I did achieve DXCC on the higher HF bands, 20, 15, and 10. That's the peak of the sunspot cycle. And that was like shooting fish in a barrel. That was pretty easy. Getting 40 wasn't so bad, but as I said, 80 was a challenge. And there you have to be a little bit more strategic and patient.
Now, you mentioned something about the OQRS system. What is the OQRS system?
This is an online system. You've caught me with my brain dead for a second, where DX stations will QSL and confirm the QSL. It works very, very effectively, but it does require some payment. And for years, I resisted the idea of sending $5 to a DXpedition just to get a QSL card. I was initially offended by the idea, but now I appreciate the fact that these are huge ventures. OQRS is what it stands for, and it's affiliated with another organization, which the acronym now escapes me. It'll come to me in just a moment. But I tried to logbook of the world, as you saw on my QRZ page. But then, again, I came to the realization that the DXpeditions deserve support, and $5 is not a big price to pay to get a QSL card to help support them.
Have you ever done a DXpedition yourself?
No, I've not. I operate a little bit portable, but when I'm traveling with my wife, it's more for fun. And all the years I was traveling on business, I just never had the time to try to get involved with ham radio. I think I have 3.5 million miles on American Airlines, but these were short trips and very intensive.
And now this message from ICOM America. Heard it, worked it, logged it. October is here and contest season is beginning with QSO parties, school club roundup, sweepstakes in November, and the CQ Worldwide contest also at the end of the month and in November. Now is the time to get the ICOM transceiver that's best suited for your lifestyle. ICOM offers a variety of high-performance and innovative transceivers that fit your ham radio budget. See how you can make the most out of contest season with one of these transceivers. The IC7851 has the competitive edge that you've been looking for and the endorsement by Dr. Ulrich Rohde, N1UL, in episode 208 of the QSO Today podcast as being the best transceiver on the market today. Raise the bar and hear what others cannot hear with this flagship HF 50 MHz transceiver. This is due to ICOM engineers focusing on a new local oscillator design that drastically reduces phase noise. This noise reduction and purity of the LO result in an RMDR of 110 dB, allowing you to hear the extremely weak signals, making the IC7851 the perfect rig for making contacts at the bottom of the sunspot cycle. In addition, this fine rig has a spectrum scope, dual receivers, and a digital voice recorder. The IC7610 is the SDR every ham radio operator wants, and just in time for contest season. This high-performance SDR has the ability to pick out the faintest of signals even in the presence of stronger adjacent signals. The new ICOM 7610 is a direct sampling software-defined radio that will change the world's definition of an SDR transceiver. Its features include RF direct sampling system, 110 RMDR, independent dual receivers, and dual digicell. The IC7300 has changed the way an entry-level HF transceiver is designed. This rig is a high-performance, innovative HF transceiver with compact design which will far exceed your expectations. It includes RF direct sampling, 15 discrete bandpass filters, large 4.3-inch color touchscreen, real-time spectrum scope, internal antenna tuner, and an SD memory card slot. No matter which ICOM rig you choose, you'll be a winner. Be sure to check out these fine rigs at www.icomamerica.com. And when you finally go to make your ICOM purchase, be sure to tell the dealer that you heard it here on QSO Today. My thanks to ICOM America for sponsoring the QSO Today podcast. And now back to our QSO. You wrote that you've trekked with your wife or bicycled to 26 countries around the world. Did you take amateur radio with you on those vacations, and how did you operate it if you did?
Yeah, no, I did not. Occasionally I would take an HT with me to see if I could work local repeaters. But again, our schedule was usually fairly tight. A lot of the traveling I did was in conjunction with a great deal of consulting that I was involved with after I retired from full-time work. I led training for Citibank and other financial institutions on credit risk. So I would run courses all over the world, and we'd do an awful lot of the traveling associated with the courses that I was doing. So in retrospect, we've been to Bhutan, and I didn't get involved with ham radio there. It would have been nice to have done that. But it's fun talking to people all over the world, especially as we prepare for some of these trips. But as you know, I now operate remotely when we travel. I pick up my cell phone, use the app from Remote Rig, click on my rig from Vermont. And last November, we were sitting in the south of France and using my cell phone, connecting to Remote Rig. I'm operating on 20 meters from Vermont, talking to another station in France. I thought that was a ball.
Yeah, that's pretty amazing. And the quality and the reliability of using the Remote Rig in the app on a Wi-Fi, public Wi-Fi perhaps, or hotel or whatever, was that okay?
Oh, it's been absolutely fantastic. Michael has done a great job with Remote Rig. And the beauty of Remote Rig over other remote options is that I have the ability to use my ICOM 7100 with the black box Remote Rig if I want, or as I said, I can pick up the cell phone or use it with a computer, but with Remote Rig, I'm not tied to using a laptop.
Oh, that's pretty amazing. And obviously you're operating single sideband in those cases.
Yes, although there is a capability of doing digital and CW. I've done digital. I just haven't quite yet figured out how to do CW with them. If I devoted some time to figuring it out, people do it, and they do it very easily. It's very well set up for that.
In your travels to these 26 countries, did you look up amateurs that you might have met on the air?
I think I've done it once, but we've never been able to get together. So, no, it has not been a big part of our travel experience.
What's the biggest takeaway from foreign travel?
The social aspect, the recognition and realization that the world exists and people have thoughts that are not necessarily the same as those in the United States. I've been to Hong Kong many times, and had been to China briefly on business. And around 2007, after I'd been doing some work in Hong Kong, my wife and I went on a biking trip, organized cycling trip in China. And we came away from that with the realization that we told all of our friends, you cannot understand how the world is changing unless you see the phenomenal growth in China, where you're bicycling through the country, you come into a city, the city's under tremendous construction, growth of apartment buildings everywhere. The population of these cities that you never heard of is 8 to 10 million people. And the realization that there are billions of people around the world who do not share the same philosophical or ethical or religious views as people do in the Western world or in the United States.
Does it give you an appreciation for the United States, perhaps, that you wouldn't have otherwise?
From the very first time I traveled, returning to the United States has always been a tremendous pleasure and source of gratification, knowing that we live in this phenomenal country. On the other hand, you also appreciate the value of being in the United States and what we have, especially as we've trekked through third world or developing countries. We have a lifestyle in this country and access to health care, and we've had to use some health care in other countries. You certainly gain a tremendous appreciation for what is available here. So, yes, it gives us both an appreciation for what we have in the United States, but also an appreciation of the fact that there are hundreds of millions of people in other parts of the world who like what they do and where they live.
Yeah, I think that's my takeaway from international travel as well. Is that human beings are amazingly adaptable and can live just about anywhere, and they can live just about anywhere quite successfully. You've spent a lot of time maritime mobile. Can you talk a little bit? How did working maritime mobile start for you?
Yes, and ham radio does have a big impact here. For reasons that I really can't quite understand, an awful lot of hams are sailors as well. There's a big community of sailors, both internationally and people who get their ham license for safety reasons, but also sailboats are a big toy, and I think perhaps ham radio operators like to have their toys. A lot of the people I knew early in my ham radio career got into sailing. And actually, I mentioned earlier, Bill W2HDI was a sailor, and we ended up joining him a little bit as we sailed. As we moved to New York and got into sailing, we bought our first sailboat in the 1970s. I had a number of ham friends who were sailors. My first experience was on a 30-foot sailboat, which we cruised and raced. We kept it on the Hudson River north of New York City. We used to sail it out to Nantucket in the summertime. And I decided to start experimenting with ham radio. I had an old Yaesu 757, a big radio. I hooked it up to the 12-volt power supply and just ran a long wire with a little MFJ manual tuner and operated DX from that. So I began to see the benefit of and the fun of operating mobile. I remember I was sitting on the boat in Block Island off the New England coast in the harbor, and I had my first DX contact. I think it was a station in Russia on sideband, and that was just tremendously exciting. And at that point, I'd probably been a licensed ham for 30 years, so it just was wonderful. We then got a 37-foot sailboat. It had solid rigging, stainless steel rigging rather than wire rigging, so you couldn't do a split backstay. And that boat had a ham on it who tried operating a whip antenna off the back. That didn't work at all. It had a decent grounding system. It had some mesh near the keel. And of course, when you're operating mobile, grounding is critical. I took a insulated wire, ran it along the backstay, something that people said would never work, and used plastic ties, just secured it to the backstay. And it worked beautifully, again, with a decent grounding system, also with a mechanical tuner. I finally bought an SGC tuner for a long wire. That worked beautifully, and I kept that one. Then we moved up to a 41-foot sailboat that we bought new. As the boat was being built, I had a copper grounding strap about 6 inches wide, fiberglassed into the bottom of the boat and connected directly to the keel, to the SGC tuner, which then connected to an insulated backstay, which was about 60 feet long. And I could, with 100 watts, and then that's when I started with first the 706, the 706 Mark II-G, and then finally the 7000 and the 7100. And I could get on and work anybody. As we were cruising along the coast, about 8 years ago, I discovered the waterway net at 7268, and I try to check into the waterway net every morning. That's a wonderful group of people, and I've made friends, sailors, as well as a friend up in Northeast Harbor, Maine, near Acadia National Park, who happens to be a ham in town, who I ran across just by operating 20 meters one afternoon, and he came through with a booming signal. So having a good ground, but lots of options for antennas.
On a sailboat.
On a sailboat, yes.
Now, just for those of us who are not nautical, although I must say that one of my early jobs as a late teenager was actually installing radios on pleasure boats. So I have a little bit of knowledge, but for those people that are not nautical, what is the backstay?
Oh, sorry. Well, of course, on a sailboat you have a mast, and the mast is held up by a wire that goes from the mast to the front of the boat and a mast to the back of the boat, and wires on each side of the boat. And the wires at the side of the boat are called shrouds, and the wire going from the cable going from the back of the boat, the stern of the boat, to the top of the mast is the backstay.
Right, and I've seen some sailboats where they will put these huge power line insulators at the bottom of the backstay and at the top of the mast, and you'd actually load up the backstay.
That's exactly what we did.
Right.
The last sailboat. It's called an insulated backstay.
Right. So you don't want anybody to like stand on the back and put their hands on it when you're transmitting, but it probably worked pretty well. And then you say the keel. Tell me what the keel is, and you have this copper strap connected to it. Does that mean that the ground is actually going into the water?
Absolutely. On any sailboat, the sailboat maintains stability through a tremendous amount of weight called the keel, which is usually made of lead, and provides a wonderful ground. I
see. And what did you do about electrolysis?
Sailboats will always have devices that will eat away and try to absorb the electrolysis. So that was never really an issue.
So you might have zinc plates on the side of the boat under the water.
Yeah, zinc anodes are usually on the prop, on the shaft.
Ah, okay. Yeah, interesting. Yeah, that's very cool. Brings back memories. I used to get seasick in dry dock on those boats. Maybe it was the fiberglass.
You get used to it. My wife still gets a little bit seasick, but the acupuncture wrist straps work very, very well.
Oh, really? Oh, that's cool. Well, I'll keep that in mind the next time I'm on a sailboat. But it's my understanding that you actually kind of morphed into a different kind of boat, and that kind of changed your ham radio operation?
Well, it did. After 40 years of sailing, we decided to what we call go to the dark side. Just wanted to go a little bit faster. We love sailing, but we really prefer cruising, and we go distances of 100, 200 miles along the coast. We keep the boat in Maine, near Portland, Maine. We go 100 miles down east towards Acadia National Park or up to Canada, or down to Cape Cod, where we spent a lot of time. So as we get older, fast is nice. So we downsized and traded the sailboat in for a power boat powered by a diesel that will go about 3 times as fast as the sailboat would. But ham radio is so important to me, and as I said, we've made so many friends in our sailing ventures. I wanted to keep an HF rig on the boat. At the same time, we had a new boat, and it looks like a lobster boat, so it doesn't have a lot of places for big antennas. So I experimented with mobile whips. I experimented with a buddy pole, experimented with MFJ whips, MFJ dipoles. None of this was satisfactory. And as I started talking to people, and again with my friend Brian W2HDI, I decided to try remote, looked at my various options, and realized that with remote rig, and since we're along the coast all the time, generally with a decent cell phone signal, or sometimes in Wi-Fi, but with a decent cell phone signal, I could operate remotely, and that's what we've been doing. It's been a tremendous amount of fun and very, very successful.
So you actually take the control head of the rig, or your laptop, or even your cell phone to operate the rig?
I have all three options. I generally will put my cell phone on Wi-Fi hotspot, and I have the remote rig black box with the Wi-Fi option connected to the head of my 7100. The base of the 7100 is here at the base station connected to the other end of the remote rig operation. So I can, yes, turn on the head of the 7100 using Wi-Fi from my cell phone and operate the base station. With the Expert 1.3 amp, I'm operating a kilowatt. My go-to antenna, I have a lot of antennas here, dipoles, I have a Yagi, but as an experiment, I put up a vertical. We had some very good experiences with emergency operations, Vermont Emergency Management, with the Hustler antennas, vertical antennas. So just as a backup antenna, since we have pretty severe weather here in the mountains, I installed a Hustler 4BTV ground-mounted 33-foot radials. And I am just amazed. This has become my go-to antenna. So it works on all bands, barely need a tuner. And so now remotely with the Expert amp, which does have a built-in tuner, also has automatic antenna switching, so I can go to my 80-meter dipole as well. I turn on the 7100 remotely, and I'm operating a kilowatt into my ground-mounted vertical antenna. I can talk anywhere in the world. But when I'm traveling or even on the boat, sometimes I'll use the head of the ICOM, or I'll use the remote rig app on my Android phone, which works extremely well, and then I don't need to use the Wi-Fi hotspot. I'm just connecting directly into the mobile cellular system. It works extremely well.
Now, do you have some kind of telemetry that comes back to you that tells you, for example, maybe AC line voltage or temperature in the amplifier, or SWR coming back, to the amplifier and to the rig?
Well, I have my non-tech version of telemetry. I have a camera set up in front of the amplifier that I can access with my cell phone.
Oh, well, that's cool. Oh, then you just read the meters right off the rig.
Yes, I have a light that I can. I have a light that I can turn on also remotely, and so I can just watch the amplifier as I transmit. Yes.
Oh, that's very cool. Wow. No, I noticed when I was looking at your online blog that you seem to be operating a lot of the digital modes lately. What do you think of the digital modes, and are you operating FT8?
I am, Eric. On the sailboat, I loved, with the laptop, I loved operating PSK 31. Low power, could make a lot of fun contacts, and I probably started doing this 10, 12 years ago when PSK first came into use. And I love to rag chew. As people started using macros more and more on PSK, it became less fun because I just didn't like the contact of, and then having to watch the macros, which I found kind of boring. So moved away from PSK. As JT65 came in, I tried it a little bit, especially as I was going for the 5-band DXCC, although I don't think it was not a critical part of 5-band DXCC. That was achieved mostly with SSB and CW and a little bit of RTTY. So JT65 was interesting, but I didn't have the patience for that. That was very slow. When FT8 came along, easy to use, very fast exchanges, and I found it a little bit difficult to set up. But I started using it probably 6 months or so ago. My friends use it to rack up the DXCC contacts. I get on, and it's interesting. It's intriguing. You can sit at your computer, do something else, have it work automatically. And it's nice to rack up the contacts, but it's sort of demeaning my achievement of 5-band DXCC, which really required an awful lot of work. This makes it easier, and because it's not chatting, I really don't enjoy it very much. But it's a phenomenal mode, and the guys who developed it deserve tremendous credit.
And now this message from QRP Labs. Well, Hans, G0UPL has done it again. QRP Labs announces a new 10-watt linear HF power amplifier kit for just $26 US. That's right, $26 United States currency. This power amplifier comfortably produces 10 watts from a 12-volt DC supply for every mode, including the high-duty cycle digital modes. This new linear amplifier provides 26 dB of gain from 2 to 30 MHz with a plus or minus 1 dB gain flatness over the entire range. This 10-watt HF linear power amplifier kit has no surface mount components to solder. There are a small number of transformers that need to be wound, and assembly requires care and patience. If you're a beginner, you can still do this kit. The push-pull driver stage uses 2 BS170 transistors in the amplifier found in the soft-walk transmitter design. This final uses 2 IRF510 transistors in push-pull configuration. Yes, this humble low-cost MOSFET is really capable of excellent performance all the way up to 10-meter band and beyond. Hans says the short lead lengths and PCB layout are extremely important to the success of this kit. This kit includes a huge heatsink to prevent overheating even during a 100% duty cycle. Hans sent me a message that he tested key down for 1 hour at 10 watts full power with no forced air cooling. He tested again for 15 minutes at 20 watts, 100% continuous duty cycle with no forced air cooling. He even tested this new power amplifier with a 20-volt DC power supply into an open load, a shorted load, and various mismatches without instability, oscillation, or failure. So if you have a QCX or any other QRP transmitter and want to boost its output power with a highly reliable linear power amplifier at an amazing price, then click on the link in this week's show notes page to tell Hans that you heard it here on QSO Today. QRP Labs is my favorite kit company. It should be yours too. QRP Labs. And now back to our QSO. You've now been retired for some time from the commercial banking business, but it seems to me, based on what I'm reading, that you're actually still quite active, especially giving advice and writing books. What are you writing books on these days that will interest perhaps our listeners?
Banking is an art. It's not a science. There are a lot of models. The financial crisis came about because people tried using models to make decisions about lending money. It's, of course, started with home mortgages, got complicated by derivatives. The fundamental of being a banker and lending money is something that people tend to forget about, and that's the very simple fact that bankers lend money with the idea that they're going to get their money back. It's as if your brother-in-law asked you to lend him money, and you reach your hand in your pocket, and before you take the money out, you say, all right, now tell me again, are you going to pay me back? And most people would have a pretty good sense as to whether or not they would get paid back or not. People tend to lose sight of that when things get a little bit more complicated and the borrower is a company or a corporation or a complex multinational corporation, or even a pool of mortgage securities. So the book I wrote was called Fundamentals of Credit and Credit Analysis. It was a culmination of culmination of the training that I did and the lessons I learned as a banker over 35 years, and the mistakes bankers made. And I tried to synthesize this into the very simple fact that the goal of a credit analyst, the goal of a banker who's being asked to lend somebody money is very simple: to understand what is the degree of risk that one will get paid back or not. And it's assessing that degree of risk that is the heart of all banking.
Well, I think the reason I'm asking you the question is that I read an article that was about you and about the advice that you were giving, and one of the things that stuck in my mind is that you're lending money to individuals. So the banking business originally was a people-to-people business where the integrity of the person sitting across from you was all about whether or not they got the loan. And I'm kind of thinking, I hear a lot of stuff in ham radio, and I see a lot of stuff on Facebook where people will say either ham radio is just so expensive that I can't afford to get into it, or ham radio is very expensive to get into, and I'm just going to go to the bank and I'm going to borrow money, or I'm going to borrow it off a credit card in order to have the right gear. I actually am coming from a different standpoint now. After 220 episodes of the QSO Today podcast, it seems to me that with kit building companies and things like that, you can get into amateur radio for practically nothing and still have a wild time. So is there advice that you'd give to amateur radio operators, whether they're experienced or they're just getting into the hobby, in terms of how they might approach the financial side of ham radio?
Oh, sure. And you make a wonderful point, because the price of gear, the price of used gear, especially now that we're having these SDR radios come out, the price of gear is next to nothing. When I went to buy the new 7100, I was looking to buy a used piece of HF equipment to operate portable. And I realized one can buy a brand new small Yaesu radio, the ICOM 7100, for $800 or $900, which is not a small amount of money. But there are, as you well know, wonderful HF transceivers that don't die, that are as good as anything out today. You can work the world with them. And you can buy a wonderful older ICOM, older Yaesu, older Kenwood for a few $100s. So save up the money and buy a transceiver. Antennas are very, very simple. I've loved dipole antennas. They cost nothing to put up except for the coax cable, perhaps. I've always run coax directly from the radio to a dipole antenna, maybe with a balun, but you can work the world. I just, as an experiment, I'm using an EdFed dipole from one of the brands that you see in QST magazine. I think I bought it commercially with a built-in balun. It was $80, and I'm working the world with 100 watts with it strung out of an attic window. Very, very easy to get involved with ham radio for a few $100s.
Right, and you don't have to go to your banker necessarily to borrow the money to do it.
No, although, as I said earlier in this conversation, Eric, I got started with my DX40 because Heathkit gave credit to a 14-year-old kid.
Yeah, but they knew a kid with a paper route was going to pay him back, I think.
Yeah, I think they probably did, actually. Yeah, I think they did, yes.
Well, I must say, I got today a wonderful email from Pete Giuliano, N6QW, who is also a podcaster. I interviewed him in episode 60 of the QSO Today podcast, and he has built another beautiful rig for $100 single sideband rig, and I'll post those pictures probably on the QSO Today Facebook site. But just to let people know that his investment is $100 and a lot of time to make a state-of-the-art single sideband transceiver. So you can do it for a lot less. It just requires maybe more elbow grease. So I guess, Arnie, that either you're going to do the elbow grease, working your regular job to pay off the ham radio, or you're going to put the elbow grease in the ham radio itself. And
well, that's right. And
But
Eric, throughout my almost 60 years in ham radio, I've never wanted to spend an awful lot of money on gear. My wife's always been supportive. I was a ham when we met, so she's always been supportive of the hobby, and partly because we've met a lot of wonderful people through the hobby. But just inherently, I objected to the idea of spending a lot of money on equipment, and it's just not necessary to do so.
Well, I owe pretty much the fact that I got married is because I was actually in Israel when I met my wife, so I didn't show up at her house with a whole dashboard full of radios to scare her off. So, but I'm sure that you probably, when you met your wife, did you have the mobile rig with the mobile rig in the car?
No, I did not. Because we met when I was a sophomore in college, so I wasn't terribly active in ham radio. And at one point, she was visiting friends in Cleveland, and I asked her to stop by my house, however, and pick up my GT30 microphone because I had a part-time job doing a recording for reading books for a blind student, and I needed the GT30 for better audio. So that was her introduction to my ham radio station.
Well, that leads me to my next question. What kind of impact has amateur radio had on your family life?
It's been central to it. Neither of my daughters were ever interested in getting a license. I tried to get my grandchildren involved. The only time they did get interested was when I was on PSK 31, and my older granddaughter had just learned to read and type, and she was fascinated by the ability to sit in front of a keyboard and communicate. But it's been absolutely central, and as I said, a lot of very, very good friendships, people we've socialized with in many different parts of the country through ham radio.
Yeah, it's pretty amazing. What excites you the most about what's happening in ham radio now?
The technology, because it is a learning experience. And while I might disdain the hunt and pounce aspect of FT8, the learning process, and I'm getting more into CW now because just to keep the brain going. But it is so much fun to learn the new techniques, to see these little SDR dongles where you can listen to the world, to go to my phone and turn on a receiver and listen to stations all over the world. And as I said, I'm just having a ball operating remotely. I sit in the car. We were driving up from Hilton Head, South Carolina last spring. The ICOM 7100 was in my front seat, connected to the black box of the remote rig. My phone was on Wi-Fi hotspot. And I'm working my QCWA Sunday morning net. And the guy's telling me, as I'm driving up Interstate 95, operating mobile, but remotely from the station. The technology is fascinating, and I'm learning every day.
Are you doing DMR?
I am, actually. I have a couple of radios. The activity is limited, but the number of stations that are being set up is mind-boggling. Activity seems to be limited. I also do D-Star, and I must say I end up having more conversations on D-Star than I do on DMR.
Do you have a hotspot?
I do. I have I tried setting up we don't have any D-Star repeaters here in Vermont, so I tried setting up my own repeater. I was singularly unsuccessful in getting that technology to work. But I have a dongle sitting in the house, so I can operate around the house, and I can operate it remotely. So I can operate my D-Star dongle from the remote station.
That's pretty cool. Are you actually building any projects with a SDR dongle?
No, I keep looking at it. Right now, I just have more fun talking.
It's a potential project at this point.
Oh, yeah. There are so many kits around, so many things to do. If I had time to do it, I would, but I'd rather just get on the radio and chat at this point.
What advice would you give to new or returning hams?
Don't spend a tremendous amount on radios. Don't focus on VHF, UHF. Get on HF. Get yourself a decent antenna. Listen and chat. Try the digital modes. experiment. Don't rule out any mode. I think that's one of the most important lessons. I hear Ham saying, well, I only do CW or I only do single sideband and I don't like digital modes. I find experimenting with all of the modes is one of the delights of ham radio.
I think you're absolutely right. Arnie, this hour has breezed by more quickly than I'd like, and I'm about to get on an airplane to go to California from here. So I'm so delighted that you said yes to and agreed to come on the QSO Today podcast, and I hope that you enjoyed it as well.
I did, Eric. Thank you very much. There was one other story I just wanted to relay.
Sure.
Back in the late 1960s, when I was working in Boston, I did operate Mobile. I had a Volkswagen Bug, and I found a AM 6-meter Lafayette radio. I put it in the VW Bug, had a halo antenna on the back of it, and I remember working DX on 6 meters, driving down the Massachusetts Turnpike on my way to Logan Airport. And at that time, you had to have a call where you lived. I was WA1 LTM, little tiny Mobile, operating 6 meters with a halo antenna and a VW Bug. That was a ball.
And what year was the VW Bug?
It was in 1968.
So it was a 12 volt. I think 68
yes.
was the first year it was 12 volts, right? As I recall.
Correct. Yes.
Yeah, so you lucked out there. Well, that's really cool.
I did. Yes, and it was a thicker bumper, so I was able to mount the mast for the halo antenna on the back of the bumper.
So I had a 66 VW Bug, and I had to use a 6 to 12 volt inverter in order to get the Clegg 22er to work in there.
That's right.
How about that? Well, that's really cool.
Eric, thank you very much. This was a lot of fun.
73, Arnie. Thanks so much.
73.
That concludes this episode of QSO Today. I hope that you enjoyed this episode with Arnie. Please be sure to check out the show notes that include links and information to the topics that we discussed. Go to www.qsotoday.com and put in W2HDI in the search box at the top of the page. My thanks to both ICOM America and QRP Labs for their support of the QSO Today podcast. Please show your support of these fine sponsors by clicking on their links in the show notes pages, or when you make your purchases, that you say that you heard it here on QSO Today. You may notice that some of the episodes are transcribed into written text. If you'd like to sponsor this or any of the other episodes into written text, please contact me. Support the QSO Today podcast by first joining the QSO Today email list by pressing the subscribe buttons on the show notes pages. I will not spam you or share your email address with anyone. Become a listener sponsor monthly or annually by clicking on the sponsor buttons on the show notes page. I am grateful for any way that you show appreciation and support. It makes a big difference. QSO Today is now available on iHeartRadio, Spotify, Libsyn, and TuneIn, as well as the iTunes Store. If you own an Amazon Echo, you can say, "Beep, play the QSO Today podcast from TuneIn." I still use Stitcher to listen to podcasts on my smartphone. The links to all of these services are on the show notes pages on the right side. Until next time, this is Eric for Z1UG 73. The QSO Today podcast is a product of KEG Media Inc., who is solely responsible for its content.